APUS History, Lesson 14, Post-1812, Sectionalism, Nationalism, and Patriotism. The War of 1812, as we discussed in our previous lesson, and you've read about in your own studies, had some real results beyond merely the peace treaty itself, in terms of national impact, national attitudes, economic changes, etc. And one of the most fundamental political changes with the end of this war was the demise of the Federalist Party. Because of their sympathies towards England, or more importantly, their anti-war sympathies in a war the United States wound up winning, the rest of the population, who were of non-Federalists, largely turned against this political body, this political entity. And this brings up a curious phase of American history, a period of sort of one-party rule. It's going to be the beginning of what we call the so-called era of good feelings. Although the name is a misnomer, it's not as if the era of good feelings was a time when there were no controversies, a time when everyone agreed. In fact, quite the opposite, but we'll see that as we go through our lesson. James Monroe becomes president after Madison's 2 terms, and the Federalist Party slides into oblivion. After 1816, it never runs a presidential candidate again. It's strictly a local party. Regionalistic party, has no formal national structure, and it will not nominate a presidential candidate in 1820, so Monroe would run unopposed. But Monroe is going to represent the end of an era, as we talk about this time period being a real transitional time. He is the last president who was eligible to fight in the Revolution. He is the last guy who wore as his daily clothing the tri-cornered hat of the Patriots and the buckled knee breeches of the Revolutionary era. We're moving into an era with new individuals coming to the fore. Individuals such as John Calhoun of South Carolina, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and Henry Clay of Kentucky. Calhoun and Clay we'd introduced previously as war hawks, pro-nationalist individuals who had advocated and lobbied for the War of 1812 and strong integration of the nation on an economic and political basis. Webster, a former Federalist, is going to be one of the few Federalists to make the leap to this new party model and survive and actually go into major political prominence in the decades to follow. But if you look at the changes in the Republican Party itself, the Republican Party post-war winds up in many ways adopting an awful lot of Federalist ideas, Federalistic policies, which is what the tertium quid, the third something, the old school Federalists, the old school anti-Federalists, the old school Democratic Republicans led by John Randolph were critical of. They said in many ways their party, the Democratic Republican Party, had left them to become something else. What had they done? They'd financed a national road in 1811 with federally funded internal improvements. They had established or rechartered the Alexander Hamilton's Bank, which was set to expire, or it expired. They rechartered it in 1816 for another 20 years. And then they passed a tariff, a protective tariff to protect American industries in 1816 as well. So the party is going to undergo serious strains here, because that's why you can't have a time of one-party rule for any sustained amount of time, because not everyone's going to fit under that big tent. And you've got this party, in many ways, embracing most of what had historically been the Federalist program. The Republican Congress, after the War of 1812, charters and maintain a large standing army and navy, something which would have been unthinkable in 1801, in 1800, when Jefferson assumes office. And so we see politics abhorring a vacuum and filling this Federalist vacuum with them being gone, meant that Republicans were going to adopt many of these roles and policies into their own, for the simple reason that some of them were attractive and they worked. Now, the so-called American system is the brainchild of Henry Clay. Henry Clay's ideas beyond the war hawk period, the war hawk early nationalist phase of his political career, establishes himself as a devout and profound nationalist who wanted to see the country integrated and pulled together. And the way to do that, he felt, was through the establishment of a three-pronged American system, a policy that involved a protective tariff and integrating the country through roads and bridges and canals, and the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. These three things, he thought, would in many ways carry on what in an earlier period would have been called Hamilton's economic vision for the United States, the growth of the free market, the growth of the business and producing and manufacturing industrial capacity and potential of the nation. Some of this hits a speed bump with the Panic of 1819, which we'll briefly mention and discuss with you, because it's going to be linkage to something that we're going to see a bit later on. Depressions in the United States are going to take place in about 20-year intervals. And the way it's going to work, I guess if I was going to show it to you in a graphical sense, if this is going to be T for time, and this is going to be, we'll say EP for economic productivity. American economic productivity did not follow for this time period a continuous, unbroken upward charting trajectory. Things were not getting better and better and better and better all the time. What you had instead was a pattern that followed almost more like a sine wave. You'd have a period of production, improvement, and then over-speculation, inflation, overproduction, followed by an economic downturn and collapse, followed by a recovery, another period of economic productivity, over-speculation, followed by collapse, followed by another period, et cetera, et cetera. But notice what you're seeing. Each time, as you're heading up this model, the economic downturn and overall economic productivity is still higher than the previous cycle's point of economic prosperity. So as you come across here, you'd have that same kind of downturn. So you see net gains overall in economic productivity during this period, the era of good feelings and beyond. Say this is going to start, this is the 1819 panic. Say this is 1819. Well, you'll also have, actually it's not, my apologies. Panic is right here. That's the downturn. You have 1819, you're going to see the same thing again. 1837, you're going to see the same thing again. 1856, and so on, and so on, and so 1856, 57, and so on, and so on, and so on, approximately 20-year intervals. What will happen is the economy will overheat and productive capacity or speculation for land sales will exceed demand, and you'll see inflation or overproduction within the economy that then has to be corrected and brought back into account. And so we'll see this model play out. Curiously enough, James Monroe was not affected by this. Today we tend to view the presidents as getting some of the credit but almost all the blame if economic times go badly. Monroe in the show tells you something about the presidency during this point in time. The presidency was not seen as being the office of this chief economic steward of the nation. Not during this time. It's going to gradually grow and develop that as a responsibility that will be placed on its plate, but we're not quite there yet. So we have the era of good feelings involving economic diversity, economic overproduction, and downturn with speculation, and the American system and its productive growth. What happens with the economic downturn is the second bank in the United States, was attempting to slow down inflation by calling in loans it had made to other subsidiary banks, because those banks have been loaning out too much money and they'd been trying to sell too much land, and the money had been getting devalued. And as such, they tried to stop this inflationary spiral of needing more money for land, but to do so, these banks that had to pay back the second bank in the United States, their vaults wound up emptying in the process, and they had to file for bankruptcy because they had overextended themselves. And so the credit bubble burst, and it liquidated these debtors. But on to a political ramification during this time. The Federalists are all gone. We discussed that already on your first slide, except for one, who is the star of the show for your second slide. The long, long reach of John Marshall. He's Federalist Chief Justice, and despite Jefferson's attempts to get rid of him, he hoped to bait him into a chance, an excuse to get rid of him with the Marbury case back in the early 1800s, failed to do so. Marshall then stays on the bench for about another 32, 33 years. And as such, long after the Federalist Party in America is a non-factor, Marshall makes decisions which lent themselves to a lot of Federalist thinking, which we've just discussed, had turned into Republican thinking as they adopted many of the Federalist policies. Notice the nature of these big five decisions here. When you see them, or these big four decisions rather, when you see them on the exam, these decisions often show up in a multiple choice context of wrong answers or right answers for what the court was attempting to do. They don't always give you the Fletcher case called for this, 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 or this. It won't be like that, but you'll see a case being brought up in a question or multiple choice format involving the powers of the state or the powers of commerce and industry and what role the court played in it. So knowing these cases can often be helpful for helping you throw out wrong answers on a case. For instance, the Marbury versus Madison case, say you get a question saying, what did that establish? Did it establish judicial review, or the supremacy of the Supremacy Clause, or federal control over interstate commerce, or declaring state law unconstitutional? You'll be able to know it's judicial review if you know that that's what Marbury case did from lesson 13. But you also might know, or lesson 12 rather, but you also might know it by being able to know what these other cases are and pick them off as wrong answers. So there's a couple different ways you can reverse engineer questions to make sure you know the right answer, either by knowing everything you got to know, which obviously who doesn't want to do that, or by knowing enough to know that certain answers must be incorrect because you know what those facts actually apply to. And that's the manner in which on our current exam, content still matters, and your mastery of content does become sort of a big deal because you need to apply it in certain ways. Notice, if you will, the trends in John Marshall's decisions. All of his decisions tended to increase federal powers and protect property rights, which is central to the free market and the business model, as well as create or generate a good corporate environment. How would they do this? In the Fletcher case and in the Dartmouth College case, we see that states are not allowed to nullify contracts, and then in the Dartmouth case, contracts in general can't be altered or changed by states. You can't nullify them, can't change them. Contract law is so important to having a sound and stable business environment. If you sign a contract with somebody and they're going to remodel your house if you pay them X amount of dollars, and they never remodel your house, well, you're under no obligation to pay them the X amount of dollars. On the other hand, if they do remodel your house, they can fully expect that you got to pay them that X amount of dollars. Either way, both parties can claim for legal action. If you pay the contractor, he doesn't renovate, you can bring him to court over that, and with the contract, it's legally binding, you're in the right. If he builds first and then waits for you to pay and you don't pay, he can bring you to court to demand fees for services rendered. You can't have a stable business environment unless, like the firmness of the earth, you've got things that can be counted on. If people are too scared because they can't trust whether or not someone's going to honor their intentions, you can't have a business environment where people are going to take risks and grow and produce and develop and try to engage in business relationships with other people they don't know. And so contracts provide that linkage. They provide that glue to the business site, to the business economy, which means that there are certain things that both parties can come forward and count on when they come forward as parties that sign that document, and they know they'll be held legally liable and have to answer for it. So in the Fletcher case and the Dartmouth case, you see that played out. The McCulloch case, McCulloch versus Maryland. Bank of the United States had a branch in Maryland, as it had a branch in all the states. The state of Maryland saw the Bank of the United States as an unwelcome competitor to some of its own local banks. And so politicians were lobbied to, in the state legislature, place a tax only on the Bank of the United States in Maryland. The Bank of the United States, the bank commissioner for the Maryland branch, William McCulloch, he sues the state of Maryland, saying you can't do this. And Maryland says, well, why not? And it goes to the high court, and Marshall sides with McCulloch. He says, if states can tax federal institutions, states can destroy them. And this is where his quote, the power to tax, the power to destroy, comes from. Marshall understood through the issues of the case that putting a tax on the state bank, on the United States Bank in Maryland, was not about raising revenue for the state of Maryland because they needed more money in their state government. What it was about instead was trying to create a competitive advantage for local banks in Maryland whose depositors would not have to pay these extra tax fees that were only being placed on the U.S. bank. It's almost sort of like tariff law, if you will, going on within a state to steer consumer decisions on where to put their dollars. Marshall says, first of all, the power to tax is the power to destroy. States can't do that to the federal government. And second of all, he links it explicitly to the Supremacy Clause, which also, key AP term, key constitutional term you see on the exam, is the notion that federal law is supreme. It's federal law, constitutional law, it's a top-down hierarchy, it is supreme. States cannot countermand or contravene federal authority or federal law in any way, shape, or form. We're going to see plenty of tests of this in all the units to come of your review as we head up to and through the Civil War and then up to and through the Civil Rights Movement, but we'll get there when we get there.